the king who became a queen. The untold story of Henri III. In the glittering courts of 16th century France, power was often measured by armies, alliances, and bloodlines. But for Henri III, the last monarch of the Valois dynasty, power also came draped in silk and scented with perfume. Born into a world of political intrigue and religious conflict, Henri's reign unfolded during one of the most turbulent periods in French history, the Wars of Religion. Yet, amid the chaos, he cultivated a court unlike any other in Europe, elegant, theatrical, and infused with his own fascination for style, ceremony, and beauty. To his allies, Henri was a refined and cultured king, a man of intellect and taste. To his enemies, he was a decadent ruler, distracted from the realities of governance by his love of fine fabrics, elaborate banquets, and the company of his famously dressed courtiers. Whispers grew into accusations. The king enjoyed wearing women's clothing, painting his face, and surrounding himself with companions who mirrored his flair. Was Henri III a monarch ahead of his time, defying the rigid gender norms of his era? Or was he, as his detractors claimed, a vain and frivolous sovereign who neglected his crown? This is the story behind the silks, the rumors, and the crown itself. Henri of Valois was never meant to inherit the French crown so soon. Born in 1551, the fourth son of King Henri II and Catherine de' Medici, he spent his early years as a prince with few expectations beyond the ceremonial duties of court life. But fate, and a string of untimely deaths, would place the weight of France upon his young shoulders. Raised in the refined yet treacherous world of the French court, Henri's education blended military training with the arts of diplomacy, etiquette, and charm. Catherine, a formidable political strategist, ensured her son was well versed in both the dance of alliances and the darker art of survival. He was bright, eloquent, and quick-witted, qualities that made him popular among the nobility and a favorite of his mother. By adolescence, Henri had already distinguished himself in battle against the Huguenots during the French Wars of Religion. Yet it wasn't the clang of swords that drew him, it was the pageantry of power. He admired the precision of ceremonial processions, the glitter of armor polished for display, and the drama of courtly banquets. Even then, his fascination with appearance and spectacle set him apart from other princes. When his older brothers Francis II and Charles IX died without heirs, the reluctant prince became king at the age of 24. It was a France fractured by religious violence, with rival factions eager to exploit any sign of weakness. Henri arrived on the throne determined to project authority, but also to shape the monarchy in his own image, cultured, elaborate, and unafraid to stand out. Few could have guessed that this young king, with his sharp mind and taste for elegance, would soon push the boundaries of royal presentation further than any of his predecessors dared. And that, dear reader, is when France's fashion budget quietly declared war on its treasury. From the moment Henri III settled into the Louvre Palace as king, the atmosphere of the French court began to change. What had once been a stage for political bargaining became a theatre for beauty, ceremony, and spectacle. Henri surrounded himself with an inner circle of young noblemen known as les mignons, handsome, impeccably dressed companions who mirrored his taste for refinement. Together they transformed the royal household into something more akin to an opulent salon than a war council. Gone were the austere fashions of previous reigns. Henri favoured elaborate doublets embroidered with gold thread, cloaks lined with rare furs, and lace collars so intricate they could have been mistaken for spiderwebs spun by angels. Perfumes imported from Italy drifted through the corridors, while exotic flowers adorned banquet halls. Even weapons became fashion statements, swords with jeweled hilts and armor polished to a mirror's gleam. Foreign ambassadors often left Paris with more to say about the king's wardrobe than his policies. While some admired his elegance, others muttered that such extravagance was unbecoming of a monarch at war. But Henry believed that appearance was itself a form of power, that the splendor of his court could command loyalty and awe as effectively as any army. This philosophy extended to courtly rituals. Every meal was a performance, servers in matching livery, musicians playing softly in the background, and the king presiding like the conductor of a symphony in silk. The dances, too, became grand affairs with choreographed displays designed to showcase both grace and authority. Yet behind the shimmering fabrics and choreographed smiles, whispers grew louder. Some accused Henry of frivolity, claiming he cared more for pearls and perfumes than for the kingdom's stability. Others saw in him a deliberate challenge to the rigid masculinity expected of kings, a sovereign who dared to redefine what it meant to rule. Little did they know the real scandal was still hanging in the royal wardrobe. If the court of Henri III dazzled with opulence, the king himself was its brightest jewel. Chroniclers of the time describe him in attire that defied convention, gowns of embroidered velvet, pearl-studded bodices, and ribbons cascading from his sleeves. He powdered his face until it gleamed like porcelain, painted his cheeks with a faint blush, and perfumed his hair so heavily that courtiers could smell his approach before they saw him. This was more than mere vanity. For Henry, clothing was a language, and he spoke it fluently. The silks and satins, often in pastel shades traditionally associated with women, were not chosen by accident. They projected refinement, wealth, and a certain theatrical dominance. In a court obsessed with appearances, Henry's style made him unforgettable, but it also made him a target. Foreign envoys returned to their sovereigns with tales of a French king who wore dresses in private and at times in public festivities. Satirists mocked him in pamphlets, portraying him as a monarch more interested in his reflection than in his crown. The church, already wary of his tolerance toward certain religious factions, saw in his attire an affront to both piety and the natural order. Henry did not retreat. If anything, the criticism seemed to embolden him. He attended masques dressed in elaborate female costumes, complete with jeweled fans and delicate slippers. At times, he hosted costume feasts where courtiers were encouraged to blur the lines between masculine and feminine dress, a spectacle that delighted some and scandalized others. To his supporters, this was the mark of a cultured ruler who embraced the arts and challenged rigid gender norms. To his detractors, it was proof that France's throne was occupied by a man too consumed by silks to lead a nation at war. But, as history shows, fashion has a way of tangling itself into affairs of the heart. In the gilded corridors of Henri III's court, whispers moved faster than proclamations. The king's personal life fascinated his subjects as much as his politics, perhaps more. His close circle of mignons was a constant source of speculation. Were they simply loyal companions or something more intimate? Courtiers observed the affectionate glances, the private conversations, the lavish gifts bestowed upon them. It was enough to keep Paris gossiping for years. Rumors painted Henry as a monarch ruled as much by his heart as by his crown. Some claimed he favored certain nobles not for their political usefulness, but for their beauty and charm. Others accused him of using flirtation as a tool, binding potential allies through personal bonds rather than treaties. In the high-stakes game of European diplomacy, even a whispered romance could shift loyalties. Marriage offered little reprieve from such talk. Henry wed Louise of Lorraine in 1575, a union meant to strengthen political ties. By most accounts, theirs was a relationship built on mutual respect rather than passion. The absence of heirs only fueled speculation about the king's private desires and the nature of his marriage. Pamphlets, some bordering on the obscene, circulated in France and beyond, mocking his perceived effeminacy and hinting at scandal. Still, Henry understood the value of perception. In an era when royal image was as vital as royal policy, he used the theatre of rumour to his advantage. By keeping his personal life a puzzle, he held the court and his rivals in a constant state of intrigue. No one could be sure where his true affections lay or whether they could be used for political gain. But behind the veils of gossip and perfume, France's stability continued to falter. Religious tensions simmered, noble factions grew restless, and enemies abroad watched for any sign of weakness. Henry's charm might win hearts, but it would take more than wit and silk to keep his throne secure. And as the years passed, the silk crown began to feel heavier than gold. By the 1580s, the brilliance of Henri III's court could no longer hide the deep fractures in France. The wars of religion raged on, draining the kingdom's coffers and testing the loyalty of even his closest allies. The same courtiers who once competed for his favour began to doubt his ability to hold the realm together. Henry's extravagant lifestyle, once a symbol of cultured majesty, now became an easy target for his critics. They painted him as a monarch, distracted by silks and ceremonies while the country bled. The pamphlets grew sharper, mocking not just his clothing, but his manhood, questioning whether such a king could ever lead France to stability. Political isolation set in. The Catholic League, once an ally, turned against him, accusing the king of weakness and moral corruption. Protestant factions trusted him little more. His attempts to broker peace often collapsed under the weight of mistrust and the lingering perception that he was more a courtier than a commander. In 1588, the Day of the Barricades erupted in Paris, forcing Henry to flee his own capital. It was a moment of public humiliation, and one from which his authority never fully recovered. The final blow came the following year, when a fanatical monk named Jacques Clément gained access to the royal presence and fatally stabbed him. Henry died at 38, the last of the Valois kings, naming his cousin Henri of Navarre as his successor. His death marked the end of a dynasty, but not the end of his legend. For centuries, historians have debated whether his flamboyance was a fatal flaw or a deliberate challenge to the rigid norms of his age. In the end, the man in silk left behind more questions than answers, and a story too rich to fade. Henri III's reign remains one of the most unusual chapters in French history, a blend of political turbulence and personal flamboyance that still fascinates centuries later. To his supporters, he was a cultured monarch who elevated the elegance of the court, embraced refinement, and refused to be bound by the rigid definitions of masculinity in his time. To his enemies, he was a symbol of weakness, more concerned with fashion and ceremony than with the harsh realities of war and governance. History rarely allows for simple verdicts. Henry's life demonstrates how power is never just about armies and laws, but also about image, perception, and the courage, or folly, to be different. His silks and perfumes may have shocked his contemporaries, but they also challenged the strict codes of gender and authority that ruled Renaissance Europe. In the end, Henri III was both a king and a figure of legend, remembered as much for his jeweled collars as for the political storms that consumed his crown. His story invites us to look beyond the surface, to consider how identity and power intertwine, and to wonder what truly defines a ruler's legacy.